lecture on the principles of the United States Constitution, specifically looking at how those principles help create a limited government, which was the goal of the framers of the Constitution when they wrote it. So the essential question there, how does the Constitution provide for a limited government? That's going to be the thing that you're actually going to address in the very end of this unit. Specifically in this case, though, for this lecture, the question or problem is, how does the system of separation of powers and checks and balances provide for a limited government? So we're looking at this little piece here first that's part of the bigger essential question, and that is the question that you will need to place, the question or problem that you will place at the top of your notes where it says question or problem. You will write that, what does the system of separation of powers and checks and balances, how does it provide for a limited government? So make sure to put that at the top. We are concentrating on this idea of how does the Constitution provide for a limited government. So, limited government here. Your notes aren't starting yet. I'll let you know when they start. Limited government is that definition that government may do only the things that the people give it to do, or that are listed in the Constitution. The American colonists believed that the British king had ruled too harshly. That's why they broke away. And so they were trying to construct a way that limited that possibility of a harsh, tyrannical king, is how they saw it. So, government power posed a threat to individual liberty. That's what they had realized from King George, and so they had to find a way to control government's power. The question is, how do you, and they Articles of Confederation, they had already dealt with this, how do you create a government that is powerful enough to effectively run a country, but not too powerful enough to become abusive of its power? Where's that sweet spot? And that's a challenge. So they developed two ideas. They don't develop two ideas. They use two ideas. One of them from Baron de Montesquieu called separation of powers. So we're going to be looking at separation of powers, checks and balances, and later on federalism and the Bill of Rights, but specifically here the separation of powers and checks and balances. So what is separation of powers? Separation of powers is in red there, that first bullet. It's the division of government's power into three branches with different and independent powers, and this is where your notes begin. That includes the legislative, executive, and judicial branch, those three separate branches. They were really fearful of one person having each of these branches' powers to themselves, so they didn't want one person with all the power in government. So they decided to completely separate those powers. And one of my favorite quotes from James Madison, where he talks about this specifically, he said in the Federalist 47, which was one of those debates over whether to ratify the new Constitution, he said, "The accumulation or gathering of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." So the idea was to break them up. And this is a good visual of how that looks. And we're going to specifically look at the legislative branch here first. The legislative branch is the branch of government that makes the laws in this nation, and it is broken down into that two-house Congress. We learned about that in the Great Compromise. We have the House of Representatives and the Senate. And we talked about how they're set up, but I just want you to know that there's those two parts of the legislative branch. And in order for a law to be passed, they have to be passed in both the House and the Senate. So, what are the powers of the legislative branch, also known as Congress? They can collect taxes, federal income taxes. I pay that every paycheck. They create money. There's a reason why we have a unified currency system. A dollar is a dollar in Kansas, it's a dollar in Florida, it's a dollar in California. They regulate money. They declare war on other nations. They have to agree to go to war, send our military into combat. And they are responsible for creating and maintaining our Army and Navy, the system that it lives under. We then have the executive branch in the middle here in red, and its job is to carry out the laws made by Congress. This includes the president, in our case today, Barack Obama, and vice president, in our case today, Joe Biden. And then they have a cabinet, and a cabinet is a group of people that the president appoints who advise him on certain things, economic issues, security, education. He has a specific person that addresses him for these issues. And so they carry out the laws that Congress makes. Some of the specific powers of president, and this is very few. The president's power has grown tremendously throughout the years, but specifically, he is basically our diplomat, our figurehead for other nations. He makes treaties or agreements with other countries, trade treaties, treaties to end conflicts, anything you can think of, an agreement between another nation. The president appoints Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court. There's 9 of them. That is the power of the president, and that's a pretty big power. They stay there for life, and he or she is the leader of the United States military. And that was one of the reasons why the Anti-Federalists didn't like the idea of the president having that power, because they thought that he would use it against the people. So those are some key powers of the president. He also does some other things like establishing what they believe to be what laws Congress should be making. They kind of set the tone by giving their State of the Union speech every year about what they think Congress should be doing. And he kind of sets the legislative tone of what kind of laws should be being passed. What do we need to work on? So he can't make law. He or she cannot make laws, but they can propose that Congress make certain laws, and they can be very forceful in that. The judicial branch, it says here in the green, they evaluate laws. It's another way for saying they interpret the law. The 9 members of the Supreme Court that make up the judicial branch, what they do is they look at laws created both by states and the federal government, and they decide if they are constitutional or not. They follow the Constitution. So the powers of the Supreme Court, like I said, they can overrule national and state laws that violate the U.S. Constitution. The other thing that the Supreme Court does is settle disputes between states. So if they have disagreement about trade, they set in, or rights to water is usually a big one. They kind of step in and deal with that. When it comes to a law being unconstitutional, for example, if Congress, for whatever reason, this is a very silly example because they would never do this, if Congress tried to pass a law that said Congress can limit your freedom of speech, that is unconstitutional because it goes against the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech, and they would strike it down. They would never write that law, but that's an example of what they do. They protect our rights as American citizens. The next principle dealing with limited government is checks and balances. So this definition is in red. It's a system that enables each branch of government to limit the power of the other branches. So while the Founding Fathers purposefully split apart the powers of government, they also loosely tied them together, as you see in this little cartoon over here. And so each branch kind of has a way to limit the powers that they have. So it's another limit on the powers of the branches of government. So this is a great little diagram showing you what this checks and balances will look like. In green we have the president, the executive branch. In blue we have the legislative or Congress. And in yellow we have the judicial branch, the Supreme Court. So let's start with the legislative branch, and you're not expected to write all these down. In fact, I just gave you some space for a few of them. But in the legislative branch we have the blue lines going to the executive and the judicial. We'll look first at how the legislative branch can limit the powers of the executive branch. Probably the major one that they have power to do is to override the president's veto, which is when the president tries to stop laws being made. We'll get to that in a second. They can also impeach the president, which is when they remove him from office or her from office for doing illegal things. Doesn't happen very often, but it has happened. The checks that the legislative branch has on the judicial branch are pretty straightforward. They can also impeach judicial Supreme Court justices. They can remove them from office for doing bad things. But also, Congress has to approve any appointments made to the judicial branch, to the Supreme Court. Any of the justices that the president tries to put there, they have to approve them. The Senate does. The Senate approves the Supreme Court justices. So the president can't just go, I'm going to put this person in the Supreme Court as one of the 9 Supreme Court justices. The Senate gets to approve them. Okay, so let's look at the executive branch. What can the executive branch do to limit the powers of the other two branches? In green here, the executive branch can put checks on the legislative branch by vetoing legislation. They can veto here, in this case means they can stop a law from going into effect. If Congress passes a bill, the president can deny it from becoming a law. Now, I already mentioned, though, that the legislative branch can overturn that by overriding the president's veto, and we'll look at that more specifically when we look at the actual parts of the Constitution. But the president can stop a piece of legislation from becoming law. And he can also make Congress come back for special sessions if they're not in session at the time. But that's not used that often. Against the Supreme Court, obviously the major power that the president has over the Supreme Court is that the president is the one whose job it is to appoint Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court. And that's a very powerful job because those justices serve for life, or unless they are impeached. But it's never happened in my lifetime that I can remember. So it's not common occurrence for that to happen. But that's a big role, appointing these, one of the 9 potentially members of the Supreme Court. And the judicial branch pretty much has one big power. For both branches, they can declare laws made by Congress as unconstitutional and any executive actions by the president as unconstitutional. If they feel the president or the executive branch are doing something that goes outside of their constitutional boundaries, their limits, they will reel them back in to where they belong and say, you are not following the Constitution, this is unconstitutional, you can't do that. So while each branch has separate powers, the other branches have kind of a leash on the other ones to kind of keep them in line. That's the point of checks and balances.